On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a 42-year-old woman sat down on a bus on her way home from work. In that one bus ride, much of the colored and women rights community were changed. That day, the bus became crowded when the bus driver instructed Miss Parks and another 3 African Americans to move their seats for the white passengers.
Rosa Parks was seated in the location behind the first 10 seats reserved for white people. While the other 3 moved, Rosa Parks remained seated. She stood up for herself and her rights. The driver still persisted, believing he had the right to move the distinction between blacks and whites on the bus. He eventually called the police, and she was arrested for violating a city law requiring racial segregation of public buses.
What impact did Rosa Parks make on the colored community? She wasn't the first person to protest on the city buses, but she was the first woman of high esteem. She was an active member of the local National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Her arrest allowed the African American community to organize a Montgomery bus boycott in protest of the discrimination of colored people. During this 381-day boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. began to protest for their rights. Rosa Parks has become known as the mother of civil rights movement because of her stand that led to the turning point in the African American community.
What impact did Rosa Parks make on the women's rights community? Arguably the most famous woman activist in American history, Parks' legacy lives on. She wasn't the first African American to fight for equality, but she was called the First Lady of Civil Rights and the first woman to be honored by the required act of Congress when she passed away. During her time alive, her movement wasn't only inspiring for African Americans. Rosa Parks influenced many women throughout the world. Her famous December 1st protest on the bus wasn't her first, and definitely wasn't her last. Rosa Parks and her husband, Raymond Parks, were involved in organizing voter league meetings and encouraged their friends to register to vote. These meetings were held in secret, of course, due to violence aimed at activists. Women throughout the world heard of these courageous acts and joined her in the fight for women's rights. Without the cooperation of her community, Rosa Parks' determination would have been swallowed up by the status quo of women that would have never changed.
Rosa Parks was just like any other African American woman who felt she was being discriminated against. However, she was one of the few who found the courage to take a stand against it.
She had no idea she'd become a civil rights icon or have such a huge impact on the women's suffrage movement. But her persistence and dedication led her to change these conditions for the future African Americans and women of America.